So thanks everybody for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce Adriana Arcia, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University School of Nursing in New York. And her program of research, in that program of research, she strives to make health information easy to access, understand, and particularly for people with limited health literacy. Her work focuses on using tailored information visualizations to return research results to participants and to communicate clinical data to patients. And she's actually here presenting at the Information Visualization Conference that's happening at the Vancouver Convention Center this week. And I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It's always fun to be able to share my work with new audiences, and I hope that you'll be able to get something out of it. So the agenda, I'm going to talk about very briefly what is information visualization, something about the steps that we take to develop visualizations and to evaluate them, and then some of the key lessons that we've learned. So this is an overview of the research that I've been doing for the past 7 years or so. So I'm going to show you two slides. And I'm going to show them quickly. I want you to think about which you prefer and why. So here's the first one. And here's the second one. Which do you prefer? The picture? Picture, yeah? Why? What's great about a picture?
Decide what you want to look at quickly and then hone into the words.
Okay, so it's overview first, details on demand, the Schneiderman mantra. What else? Yeah, it's not a wall of text. Yeah, ultimately visual, yes.
It doesn't look like arithmetic.
It does not look like arithmetic. Indeed, you don't have that looks like division. Yeah, so this is the premise right behind the work, that we want to make health information more engaging and more accessible. And what we found was that the literature didn't have very much guidance on how to do that. When you look at the literature on visualization within healthcare, the focus has been primarily on risk communication, which is about part to whole relationships of the people who take this drug. How many will be affected with the side effect versus the group of people who take drug B. And some work on pictograms for medication administration. More recently, there's been some work on returning lab results. How do you show lab results in patient portals, for instance? But we found that we did not have a lot of guidance for how to display the variables that we were interested in, and that's how we got started on this. So, very briefly, we've seen a proliferation of consumer health informatics, as they call it in academia. And so we see numerous apps for health. We see websites in the millions probably of varying quality. Hopefully healthfinder.gov is one of the better ones in the US, and patient portals, right? And we see, for instance, these icons to help people orient people to where they want to go. And so that's sort of the little, the relevance, I guess, of this to informatics. So when we talk about visualization, we're actually talking about a variety of different things. One is imaging. That's your CT scans, your X-rays, that sort of thing. We're not talking about that today. That's a whole other thing. We're also talking about data visualization, which is, it can be static, it can be interactive, where you are looking at some complex thing like this image of Mount St. Helens, and often it's used for knowledge discovery. We're not talking about that today either. Today we're talking about information visualization, where usually there's a point of view. Usually the information has been pre-digested in some way because there's a point that somebody wants to get across. So I tell my students, if you're visualizing, you are editorializing, and to think very carefully about what your point of view is, and is it the one that you really want to put forth. So on the left is an example of what I call a generic infographic, in that it's static. Everybody who sees this sees the same image. In this case, this is very useful for me because I don't drink coffee, and to me it's a mystery why there's a million names for coffee. On the right is an example of a tailored infographic, which means that we have some data, some information about the viewer, and the characteristics of the graphic change to display those data back to the viewer. So this is my diagram, my illustration of my conceptualization of how we tailor infographics. I don't code, I don't have a technical understanding, so this is like my Disney version of what happens inside the computer. Basically, we have the data, right, that we feed to the machine. And we point the machine at the data, we say, this is the database you want to use, and then RStudio is the interface that we've been using to interact with the system. Say, give me this graphic, and from case number 117, right? And the system is programmed using the style guide, which is a set of specifications that I give to my my architect or my coder, whoever's doing the programming, and I say these are the variables you're going to need. This is what it should look like when it spits out. This is what the Spanish text should look like. All those things in a structured way, and then they get to make the decisions about how to actually make that happen. So that's programmed in, and then the system, which we call Entice, pulls the individual graphical components and assembles them and spits out a PDF. So that's what we developed a few years ago now. I really want to update this, make it web-based, much more user-friendly than RStudio. We got to get the funding for that, make that happen. So, hello, come on in. I'm going to talk to you today about what essentially are 4 different projects. And as you can see, we've covered a variety of different types of data. So in the first one, this was a community health survey where we wanted to return the data to the participants. And the data that we had blood pressure, BMI, and waist circumference, but then the rest were all patient-reported outcomes like physical activity and overall health. The second project was with family caregivers of persons with dementia, Hispanic family caregivers, and most of the outcomes that we were measuring had to do with caregiver burden, mental health, and also the stages of dementia. And then the last project is a little bit more, it's a little bit different because it's intended for clinical use. We haven't actually moved it into that arena yet, but the idea is to communicate information in a clinical setting. So to help the provider and the patient understand what is the level of asthma control and what do the pulmonary function test results mean. So this is very important. Not all visualizations are created equal. What we see on the right is probably developed by Apple. It looks beautiful. It's probably been, professional designers and focus grouped to death, and it looks fantastic. And this is another one that I really like. This is from Bedsider. It's a really nice, straightforward infographic that gets the point across about what are the pros and cons of different methods of birth control. What do they look like? What's the chance of getting pregnant with each of them? I think this is fantastic. But then you see stuff like this, which is just a mystery to me. They were trying to communicate scientific information about Alzheimer's disease with these images. And not surprisingly, their results were not, they did not find these to be particularly efficacious. And so the reason I point this out is not to make fun of this work, but to point out that when we look at the literature about visualization, we have to think about what's being tested is often, how good is this format, right? Or maybe how does it compare to this other format? And when we look at the results, we have to take into account what was the quality of the execution. Because if they conclude they're both terrible or they're both great or whatever, if the execution wasn't good, then you have to really take those results with a grain of salt because it really does matter. And some of the details in how you present information really matter, and I'll show you some examples of that later. Oh, yeah, here we go. Good design matters. So particularly when it's high-stakes information. So if you're communicating to somebody how many units of insulin they're going to inject, you had better get it right because the consequences are serious. And the second thing is that content is king, and that really drives all your decision-making. So if you want to get into visualization, the first step is understanding what is it that you're going to communicate, because small differences in that can take you on very different roads. So these are the basic visualization steps. You want to understand your audience. Are you talking to patients? Are you talking to pediatric versus geriatric patients? Are you talking to hospital administrators? Are you talking to other nurse scientists, et cetera? Then you want to specify the purpose. Why are you communicating? And the content, right? Be very specific about the content and even down to every last word that you're going to use because it affects your layout. And then design and refine. I'll show you some examples of that. And then you want to evaluate your desired outcomes. For me, the work that I've been doing has been all about supporting comprehension. And so our evaluation has been based on that. But if you have a different kind of desired outcome, then you would choose different methods. So when it comes to understanding your audience, in my case, I was working often with community members and with patients, not professionals. So oftentimes when we're communicating or in a consumer health informatics frame, we're thinking about, often the goal is to skill up. Here's how you put on a condom, here's how you inject your insulin, these are the signs you should look for, warning signs in this particular health condition. And we want to think about the needs of adult learners in particular. Adult learners are, unlike those of you who are students right now, most people are coming in with a different, their job, they're not thinking my job is to learn. They're thinking my job is to, be a parking lot attendant and then there's this other health thing that I have to deal with in the meantime. We want to think about culture. I love these images on the right. They're from HSBC Bank, from an advertising campaign they had some years ago. And I love how they very, very vividly and succinctly get across the point that context has a serious impact on how you interpret an image, right? Your cultural views that you bring with you and the context in which you see them. Even the same person, right, in different contexts will interpret images differently. We want to think about health literacy, literacy in general, and is your patient that you're communicating with, are they newly diagnosed, or are they a professional patient that knows more than you do about this health condition because they've been living with it all their lives? That speaks to the level of domain knowledge. And what I found is that sometimes people don't have so much an issue with understanding the information, but they might need help with the implications. What are the next steps that I need to take? So I'm going to mention some theories, a handful of theories that I have found to be very, very useful in my work. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, when I first started learning theories in nursing school and then in graduate school, they're just presented, and then you go, okay, that's nice. And I hope to show you how I actually apply these theories. So one is Knoll's adult learning theory, also known as andragogy instead of pedagogy. And the idea is that adult learners, people don't just go, I think I'm going to learn about, HbA1c today. They have to feel a need for learning, right? There is a problem that has presented itself, and to deal with that problem, I want to change the light socket. I'm going to find a video on YouTube that tells me how to do that, and voila, I have gained the skill that I need. I didn't learn all about electrics. I just learned how to do this one thing. And people really, they have the desire to increase the competency. So that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the needs of our audience. And then probably you all are very familiar with Jansen-Becker's health belief model, but just in case. The idea is that if you want to get people to take a particular health action, then the likelihood that they're going to do that depends on how much of a threat they perceive to their health and what the benefits and barriers are to taking that action. And those things are influenced by a variety of things, one of which is cues to action. So when I think about visualization, I think of it as fitting into that box of cues to action. You see something and it prompts you to perhaps, oh, that's right, I need to take my flu vaccine, right? Which I just got mine the other day, so I'm happy about that. The school makes it ridiculously easy. I went down one floor and was done in 5 minutes. So the application, right here, visualization is a cue to action. This was one of the visualizations we did for our very first project, returning research data to participants. And people understood this right away because anybody who has a cell phone understands the consequences of the image on the right, of this red depleted battery, right? And so you see that, and I mean, in this case, the viewer is doing pretty good, right? They're a little bit feeling run down. But if you had the data on the right, then that would probably make you go, oh, maybe I should do something about this. So then when we specify the purpose and the content, at a minimum, people have to be able to comprehend your message. You may have additional goals, awareness, engagement, some kind of action like getting the flu shot. And as I said, evaluation is going to be based on those outcomes. And then you want to think very carefully about what is your message. And when you think you're sure, ask yourself, are you sure? Because, for instance, let's say you want to say something about depression symptoms, right? And how you visualize level of depression symptoms may be quite different than how you visualize intensity of depression symptoms. So those kinds of small variations make a difference in the road that you take. And you also want to think about the mental tasks that are necessary for people to comprehend the message that you're sending. So in this case, this is the level of asthma control graphic. And the tasks of the viewer, they have to identify numerical value, 3.2, there it is. They have to interpret the meaning. So they're comparing it to the reference ranges and coming to a conclusion about that, making a value judgment about that conclusion, and then figuring out what to do, deciding on a course of action. In this case, we provide some steps for the person that are tailored specifically planned for you. This is what you should do to get your asthma in control. A useful theory at this point is Gagne's theory, hierarchy of learning, which has been super useful for me, and I think about it a lot. And it sounds kind of obvious, but when you make it explicit, that's when it becomes useful. And the idea is that sometimes before you can know C, you have to know A and B first. And the paper was in 1962. It's about teaching math to high school boys. But it's like, you start, what do you want somebody to know? And what do they have to know to get there, given only instructions, right? So if I want to do long division, what I need to know, addition, subtraction, multiplication, simple, division first before I can get to those steps. And so when we think about that, we want to think about how do we give information in the right order so that people can just very easily move from one step to the next to get where you want to go. And sometimes it's really straightforward. There's only 2 or 3 steps, and so you just can think about it. But if it's more complex, sometimes you have to start at the end and work your way backwards to figure out what that hierarchy is. So my illustration of that is that we were trying to show people the results of their lung function test. And in this case, I was really trying to just do a data display, right? Here's the value judgment. Here's how we arrived, these are the relevant numbers that are applied to that. And people hated this. Like, they really did. And they just felt this was overwhelming. I was trying to, with the layout of the numbers, communicate that it's 2.7 divided by 3.8 is 71%, kind of the implicit division by the layout. And it did not work. So I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do. And I thought, what would Gagne do, right? Gagne would scaffold the information, right? So then I thought, let me walk somebody through it. Let me do more like a visual explanation. Aha, today you blew out 2.1 liters of air. And then I deprioritize certain information. I say, this is nice to know, but it's an annotation. How much is that? Well, as it turns out, Americans don't know liters. So we have to convert that for people. And the only cultural reference point that people have in the US for liters is 2-liter bottles of soda. Everybody knows what that feels like. You have a sense memory of it. So it's very accessible. What's expected of women like you based on, and then you can see the criteria on the right-hand side. And then what's the result? What does that ratio work out to be? What's the result? What's the value judgment? So this was my first draft of this. And then my graphic designer got a hold of it and made it much prettier. So here we've turned it into a pamphlet. We put the title on the cover to make sure people don't skip it. I probably don't have time to get into the story of why we did that, but make sure people read the title. And then we have this much prettier layout where we're taking advantage of the fact that people are generally going to start on the upper left corner. And I watch people as they look at this. And I sit across from them and I watch where their eyes go. And you can see the eyes go down the left side and then over to the right. Perfect. That's exactly what we want you to do. And instead of having, we've kind of, all the numbers are still there. All the same content is here. But I was told by somebody who had not completed high school that anybody could understand this, which of course for me is incredibly gratifying. But I had a research participant tell me, I will remember those bottles forever, right? that's wonderful and vivid to have come up with an image that resonates with people, right? And we're doing this in division of these two values implicitly with the bottles by stacking them on top of each other. I saw, we only did comprehension tests with 10 participants because it was a small pilot, but I did see one participant who had some college education. I saw her go, she kind of pointed to the two things and kind of nodded. I could see that she was understanding that it was the division. It's something, you can't put that in a publication because it's just this thing you observe. It's not very rigorous. So once you've decided on your content, then you're going to design and refine. And we use an iterative participatory, hybrid iterative participatory design process, which means that we don't start with participants from the very beginning because that tends to waste a lot of time. They tend to try a lot of things that we know from design principles are dead ends. So my designer and I get together and we come up with as many different ideas as we can to show what we want to show. And we kind of try to get rid of the clearly terrible ideas. And then we take those ideas to participatory design sessions. We work with our target audience and we show them, for instance, before I build the whole graphic, I show them just the 3 category illustrations. And what do you like? You know, and they go through those and then we iterate between sessions based on that feedback until we reach design saturation, which is the point at which the feedback that we're getting is not really substantially contributing to the design. Like, let's make that orange slightly darker. Okay, I don't need to go to another group for that. But they're also expressing satisfaction with what we're showing them. Yeah, yes, I understand that. Yes, it is appealing to me. So this Klein's data frame theory of sense making has been so helpful for me. And the idea is that when you go out into the world and you're presented with new information, you have to make sense of it, right? So data's coming in and you are preloaded from your prior experiences with what are called frames. You can think of them as schemas, for instance. And you try to fit the data, you pick a frame, try to fit the data to the frame. And if it fits, perfect, you have made sense of it based on your expectations. If it doesn't fit, then your choices are either improve your frame or reject it and try another one, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to use images that help people to suggest an appropriate frame. So when we use stoplight colors, for instance, people know that there are value judgments associated with those colors. And so you're suggesting, hey, how about think about it this way? And so choosing the right images is really all about thinking about what kind of frames are people likely to choose, how do we draw people away from frames that are inaccurate or inappropriate for the situation. You don't want somebody to stumble down the wrong path, because it's particularly with somebody who's a novice to the topic, it's very hard to get them to abandon a frame once they've settled on it. And so you really want to try to get them on the right path to begin with. The second one, I was only introduced to this very recently, so I haven't really had a chance to use it yet, but I'm super excited about it. It's called conceptual metaphor theory. And the idea is, I think this had a lot of impact on linguistics. The idea is that we try to understand things and phenomena based on what we already know by creating metaphors. So one of the examples is they use is argument is war. And if argument is the source and argument is the target, war is the source. You know about war and you're trying to learn something about argument, then there are what are called entailments, which is the logical consequences of bringing that metaphor over. If argument is war, then that means that there are opposing sides. That means that you can be armed or disarmed. That means that you can win or lose, right? And so if you can choose a good conceptual metaphor and the entailments are appropriate, and the further the entailments go, like the more you can extend that metaphor and it still holds, the better, right? Because then you can learn about the target very quickly because you are bringing in, it's very similar to frames in that way. And so I read this paper this past year by Paul Parsons, who presented it last year at the same conference that I was just at. And he talked about how intuitive graphical conventions that we feel are intuitive, it's not just because they're familiar, but because they're working with a conceptual metaphor that make sense to us. So this idea that more is up, right? If you filled a container with water, you understand that more is up, which is why bar graphs that go from bottom up feel intuitive, and more so than the ones that go down below the x-axis. Similarly, time is distance. We put time on the x-axis going from left to right because we read from left to right, but also this idea that as we're walking down the street, time is passing. So I started to think more about this, and in the next project, I want to see what happens if, armed with this theory, I can make better decisions sooner by being more explicit about what conceptual metaphors I'm choosing. So here's the application. We wanted to use images that suggest that appropriate frame. So on the upper left, we've got caregiving burden. We used trees going from bare to lush to symbolize overall health. With self-mastery, people don't think there's actually little things hanging about somebody's head, but rather we're talking about the domains that maybe make up some person's life and how in control they feel about that. We used weather in the head to show psychological distress, and then of course the bottles for the leaders. So here's an example of trying to understand viewers' frames, and this one was really, really interesting because there is a measure called IQ code where you ask a series of questions about there's a care recipient with dementia and their level of mental functioning. And so you ask, compared to 10 years ago, how is so-and-so at blank task? And then you average those up and you get a number. And so the scale goes from 1 to 5, from much better to much worse. And when I looked at this, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Who's going to be much better? But in the data set that we had, there were observed values that were quite low on this scale, meaning better. So I said, well, I'm going to have to visualize them. And I took this to my participants, and they rejected this soundly. They got very confused because in their world there is no better. It's only going to get worse, was the mental frame that they were applying. And I saw this consistently through every graphic that we looked at. They wanted positive values on the left and negative values on the right, with this idea that time is distance and we're going from good to worse. And they wanted everything that way so that it would be consistent with their frame. And so, we have that here, positive values on the left, but because in their world there is no better, it actually impaired comprehension. I asked somebody, okay, what if your score is 2.2? What does that mean? And they said, well, you're not so bad, but you're not so great either, when it actually means better. Because they wanted to make 1 be the starting point, right? And everything to the right of 1 is worse. So I had to truncate the scale to match the frame. And then this they were able to use and not have a problem. Of course, if I had somebody who did have a 2.2, then I would have to use a different scale. And then here's the thing about conceptual metaphor theory. In retrospect, I was able to see, as I was writing this paper, I was like, now I understand why this didn't work. So the very first draft of the lung function graphic was this. There's a piece of it here where I tried to use an icon array to show the part to whole relationship, how much lung function, and trying to signal with the different colors of gray and clear, anyway, what I realized later was that I was trying to use the lungs are a container metaphor, right? And the participants who saw this applied a different metaphor. They applied good is light and bad is dark. And so they wanted me to flip the colors because this all looks like obstruction and it's dark, so it's bad. It was upside down to them. Well, I ended up kind of coming back to the lungs or container. I kind of circled around with the bottles, but the metaphor that I'm using here is air is a liquid. Because the fact is this is completely inaccurate. If you put gas in a container, it'll expand to fit the container. And yet nobody complains about this. Right? I was worried about this, but not a single person has ever complained about this because they're accepting this metaphor that air is a liquid in order to be able to understand and get a handle on the measurement. So then the last step is evaluating the desired outcomes. And as I mentioned, the method depends on the outcome. So do you want people to be able to accurately perform a behavior? There's studies about illustrations and dosing guides to help parents drop the correct amount of pediatric liquid medication for their children. So they actually give them this stuff. Can you do it right? A lot of the visualization literature uses multiple choice questions. They try to do stuff with Mechanical Turk, and it's very easy asynchronous administration, and it's very attractive to people because it's subjective. But there are some serious cons. One is that there are some people for whom this format is not familiar. And we saw that in our community with especially some of our elders from the Dominican Republic. They had not really been exposed very much to multiple choice questions. And so in some cases, the questions were more confusing than what we were asking them to comprehend. And so I tried to do this very, randomized controlled study with the text versus the images and the multiple choice questions, and it just failed completely. The other criticism of multiple choice questions that I think is probably the most important one is that they lack ecological validity, which is to say that when I go out into the world and I encounter new information that I have to comprehend, I'm not simultaneously presented with a short list of options, one of which is guaranteed to be correct. Okay, right? That's just not how it works. And particularly if you're working with professional audiences, many of whom have been standardized tested to death by the time they become professionals, they can be very good test takers. I'm a very good test taker. It doesn't, I got really good scores, doesn't mean I'm smarter than my colleagues. No, I'm just really good at taking tests. And so that can inflate your scores. And it's a validity issue with your study. There are some interview methods, but there are pros and cons to those as well. There's the element of subjectivity. There's the element of how good is the interviewer? Can they elicit the information that's needed without contaminating the subject? And that's an issue, right? So I was really struggling with this. How do we do this in a way that's rigorous, that the reviewers will think is okay, but that is respondent friendly? And by accident, just digging in publications, I found out about the ISO 9186 method, and I thought, where have you been for the last 2 years that I've been looking for you? And this is, I don't know why this is here. The ISO 9186 method is the International Organization for Standardization. They have all kinds of standards about all kinds of things, but this one in particular is about testing the comprehensibility of symbols. So let's say you have a sign for slippery floor, and you want to make sure people understand it. That's some pictogram for slippery floor. You print that at the top of the page, and then you have question, what does this mean? And you have people, and there's a line where people can write in the answer. And then depending on the item or the image, you might also ask, what action do you take in response to this, right? So and there's a space for that as well. And then those are scored by independent raters who score them as correct, incorrect, or opposite meaning, which is of course even worse. And the standard is 66% for regular symbols. That's the standard of comprehension for it to be approved, and 85% for safety symbols. Does that seem low to you? It seems low to me. I think if it's insulin administration instructions, it better be better than 85%. But it is helped me to have some benchmark for thinking about what is an acceptable failure rate, right? Not everybody's going to comprehend your graphic. It's just not possible. Not every graphic is going to work for every person. So what is acceptable? And nobody can answer that for me, but I think it's because the answer is very context dependent, right? If it's slippery floor, that has less, or restaurant, it's a lot lower stakes than even slippery floor. So, but to make this work for me and my participants, I needed to modify the method. So I modified it for verbal administration, and there is precedent for doing so. There's a study from '99 where they tried different conditions. And what I did was I said, tell me what you think it means and I'll write it down. And the idea was that the participant would have an opportunity to then, edit what I had written if they just until they were satisfied that what I had written down was what they intended to say. And we audio recorded that and transcribed it. But before we started, I gave them an example, and I think this was really crucial to help get complete responses. I showed them this image of the no smoking sign. And I said, let's say I show this to someone and they tell me you can't smoke near here. And so then I would ask, what do you mean by near here? Or just tell me more, right? So give people an understanding of, yes, I want every detail. Even if it seems obvious, tell me everything. And then what I found was that people just spoke freely. They did not care what I was writing down. They were not paying the slightest bit of attention to that. They would just talk. And so what we ended up doing was scoring the transcripts, which is more rigorous because, of course, then the rater can see what did the interviewer say. And so we used this rubric here where we were showing those two graphics, the asthma control one, the number line, and then the lung function test graphic. And we had 2 GIST comprehension questions, which to us were the most important. Do you get the general idea? Is your asthma controlled or not? Is it mild, moderate, or severe? And then we had the verbatim questions, report to me the actual value of how much you blew out, for instance. So I only have a minute or 2 left, so I'm just going to breeze through very briefly some of the lessons that we've learned. We learned that sometimes more is more. There's the design dictum that less is more, but sometimes more is more. So people strongly prefer the image on the left because it has more information, right? Even people with low numeracy, it still helps you to contextualize those numbers better. Here's another example. This is an early version of that level of asthma control graphic. People strongly preferred this. And I wasn't surprised, but I just wanted to test it again with another variable. And so here we see that this was our very popular BP graphic. We're giving people familiar analogies with the stoplight colors. We're showing them how we arrived at that number. We're giving them some context for why you should care about this. Interpretation. So this was one of the lessons we had to learn the hard way at the beginning, which was that our participants, you'll see in the New York Times and different things, you'll see a convention where they use multiple repeated icons of something to represent multiple instances of a more general class of things. Isotype is the origin, I think, probably of this convention. And it just wasn't familiar to our participants. And so what happened was that I had another version of this graphic that was just apples. And they would say, oh my God, Victor eats so many apples, 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 apples. Nobody talked about any other kinds of fruit. And I said, well, we want to show a variety of fruits. What do we do? And they said, well, you have to put a variety of fruits. So I went and did this, and then I came back to the next group, and I showed them the apples, and I showed them this, and they said, this is much better, because you can see there's a variety of fruits. But then I brought this to a group, and I didn't show them the apples first. I just showed them this. And they said, oh, Victor eats the same fruits every day. And I had my sweet little old ladies just scrutinizing this image and going, bananas, grapes, a whole pineapple. I thought Victor eats a whole pineapple every day. So this was a real problem, this low level of abstraction, fruit, physical activity. We really struggled with this. And we ended up just doing some simple bar graphs because it forced people to read the title. But hopefully somebody who's more talented than I will come up with a better solution. Just very quickly, some images. When we tried the weather in the head, they said don't use the rainbow because the rainbow implies that it has already rained. Deep. This one, they said it's very important to have the text label because otherwise I would think it's just an eye crying. I wouldn't necessarily, and also somebody told us it looked like a gang tattoo. Yeah, we got rid of that one. And then this one, people told us, they understood the balloons, but it wasn't personally meaningful, whereas the lungs are like, that's what my asthma feels like. You nailed it, right? I felt very good about that one because that one, my graphic designer does a lot of stuff, but I did the lungs myself, so I was very pleased. And then we've talked about the intuitive scaling. This one was a scale of psychological distress that has 6 items, and they're scored from 1 to 5, so your total is 6 to 30. But people are going, why does it start at 6? They don't care how it's scored. It makes no sense. Why does it go 6 to 30? This is ridiculous. And so we had to change it to 0 to 30. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. We just subtracted 5 and we made it 1 to 25. And then here, I've started adding more text back in. So here I'm just giving away the punchline. And I'm saying your asthma is not in control. This is your score. I'm adding a lot of redundancy, right? You're getting the message from the value, from the number line, from the colors, from the text, from the endpoint illustrations, because what happens is that you see people go, they get confidence, right? As everything is leading them to the same conclusion, and so they feel more confident about their interpretation. And they told us, it's all very well and good to tell me that my asthma is not controlled, but I need to know what to do about it. And so that's why we paired it with the next steps. So the very last thing is just to show you some of the pictograms that we created with the help of the participants to illustrate the functional stages of dementia. So right now, I am probably within days of starting heuristic evaluation on the prototype, the clickable prototype of the interface. So this is the welcome screen, and this is the home screen where you have these options to find out about the stages and the resources. So this is, we took the pictograms and we put them into this kind of road going through the various stages. You can click on them and find out a little bit about, what are the characteristics of that stage. You can make notes and you can link to resources that are, will be curated to reflect the needs of the caregiver at that stage. And that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.